Hey runners, just another running coach here. Today we're going to talk about something a little more difficult than usual. We're going to address how to deal with setbacks in our training and by extension, setbacks in life. Whether you're facing an injury or you're hitting a rough patch in your training, career, or personal life, it can be really hard to cope with the stress of what if and what now. And on one hand, these are entirely valid feelings. You have every right to allow yourself to feel them. And for many people, acknowledging your pain and what you had to lose can be a great source of motivation and a reminder of how strong you've become to believe in your potential. On the other hand, it's really important to have healthy coping strategies to help you avoid getting too down, since that short-term grief can lead to long-term problems if left unchecked. And before I go any further, I want to make it absolutely clear that while I'm really passionate about this subject, I'm not a psychologist, sports or otherwise. I'm not licensed to give any kind of advice other than as a running coach, and I fully respect the scope of my practice. That being said, I can speak as someone who's gone through some pretty rough patches with autoimmune disease and on a far serious level as an athlete, amateur athlete at least, and I do hope that by sharing some of my coping strategies, you might find something useful here. All right, bringing it back to running for a moment, before we start talking about some strategies, we're going to take a look at the 5 stages of grief running edition. If you're not familiar with the 5 stages of grief, they're 5 distinct stages of emotions that we tend to experience when confronted with a setback or trauma. The stages are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. For runners, the stages are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Say what you will, us runners may be strange beasts, but we grieve just like anyone else. So let's break it down one by one. If a first-time marathoner gets hurt at mile 20, it's a very normal thing for their first instinct to be one of total disbelief. And it makes sense. They put in an incredible amount of work, dedication, time, sweat, and belief in themselves just to get to this point. For them to break down when it matters most doesn't align with the strength and the resolve they've come to recognize in themselves, which is incredibly infuriating. That's when the anger starts, and unfortunately, us runners tend to take it out on the people who least deserve it, ourselves. We start asking ourselves, why did this have to happen to me? Why did this have to happen now? And if we allow this anger to go completely unchecked, it can get ugly real fast, calling our bodies stupid, seeing ourselves as weak rather than strong, and other forms of not only figurative, but literal self-harm. This is where we really need to be self-aware. By comparison, bargaining can actually be somewhat of a virtue because it's a stage where we come to terms with what we could have done better, whether that has to do with gaps in our training, flaws in our racing strategy, neglecting certain weaknesses, or going against the advice of medical professionals. The problem is that these are all framed in hindsight, coulda, shoulda, woulda. And while there's a time and a place for reflection, it doesn't really make the grieving process any easier in the moment. Besides that, it's very dismissive of all the things you did right, which shouldn't be ignored. Now, there's a lot to say about the 4th stage. There's depression with a capital D and depression with a lowercase d. For capital D depression, otherwise known as clinical depression, please know that it's always okay to seek the help of mental health professionals, and it's important to speak with someone who can give you a proper diagnosis and supportive care if necessary. For lowercase d depression, which is what the 5 stages of grief are mostly referring to, this is the part that usually hurts the most. We may see ourselves as bad runners. We might start to think that we should have never tried to chase our goals in the first place. We might even question why we even care at all. What's the point of doing this if my body keeps failing me, if I'm the slowest runner that I know, if my fastest times are behind me, if I keep getting my hopes up for no reason. It might seem overly dramatic to a lot of folks out there, but there's a lot of people who probably have these thoughts fairly regularly, especially new runners who are just trying to get comfortable with the idea of themselves running and being a runner. Fortunately, for most people, depression does eventually give way to the 5th and final stage of grief, acceptance. And while going through all 5 stages is a natural part of the grieving process, ideally, we want to get to the acceptance phase as quickly as possible. So, what's that sound like? I may not have achieved my goal this time, but that's okay. When I feel ready, I'm going to do my best to improve and achieve it next time. I may be injured, but I'm human and that's normal. I'm going to seek professional help to get the support I need so I can come back even stronger. This is the kind of mindset we want to try to have. Easier said than done, but now I want to go over how we can navigate each stage in a productive, healthy way. Going back to denial, the best thing we can do as soon as something goes haywire is to try and acknowledge what's happening in the moment. We don't need to worry about why just yet. We just need to be honest with ourselves. We need to be observant. We don't need to be ready to accept everything that's happening yet, but we do owe it to ourselves to be forthright with what we're experiencing and feeling. The faster we do that, the faster we can take care of ourselves and get the support we need, especially when we're experiencing physical pain. When I was first diagnosed with Crohn's disease, I spent a good 3 or 4 years in denial that my disease was wreaking havoc on my body. Actually, even before my diagnosis, I spent an entire year essentially shrugging off my symptoms and chalking them up to stress. Runners are a tough bunch, but sometimes we can be too strong for our own good. And we run through injuries, we shrug off aches and pains, and the more we invest in our training, the more we tend to normalize suffering. It's a very strange phenomenon, but this is true in many aspects of life. If you're feeling fine physically but are hitting a rough patch in your training, it's okay to put a pause on things and take time to assess what's not working as well as you hoped. And again, the faster you do that, the sooner you can take action. As for anger, I'm a firm believer that the #1 cure is humor. I've come to know a lot of people, runners and otherwise, who have overcome some really challenging obstacles in life. And the common thread for the ones who came out on the other side even stronger than before was that they never lost their sense of humor. And if you follow my Just Another Runner documentary series, you'll see some truly great examples of this. Now, I'm not saying we should never allow ourselves to be angry, but trying to find the humor in the absurdity of our predicaments really goes a long way. One of my favorite sayings that a good friend once said, may she rest in peace, was to laugh always, even when it is buggy. And that came from what should have been a beautiful, pleasant camping trip on a beach where it was just so ridiculously buggy and we were getting bitten every which way, even as we were trying to sleep. But my friends and I have such fond memories of that trip because we just could not help but laugh at how reality did not meet our expectations. So if you hit the wall during a really important race that you've been training months for, it's understandable to feel frustrated. But remember, at the end of the day, we should still be able to laugh at ourselves a little bit for willingly running for miles and miles without being chased by a bear. My tip for dealing with the bargaining stage is not really a direct answer to bargaining itself, but I do think after acknowledging and finding humor in your situation, the next step you're going to want to take is to figure out what you're in control of and what you can do in the present moment to help yourself out. Most of the time when bad things happen to us, they're either an unintended consequence of something that we did. An example of that would be pushing ourselves too hard to the point of injury, or it's simply bad luck that was just out of our control to begin with. An example of that would be you're going out for a perfectly normal run and for whatever reason you have a freak accident, or you later discover that an injury or your lack of progress was the result of an underlying health condition that you had no control over. Unfortunately, a lot of challenges that we face in life are of the latter variety, and I know firsthand how scary and frustrating it can be to be dealt a setback that you feel you didn't deserve and has seemingly no explanation or way to control it. That being said, no matter how hopeless a situation can feel, we still have an amazing amount of control over our lives, even if the long-term goalpost has to move a little bit. So this is just my roundabout way of saying that instead of bargaining, which can be a natural progression of denial, We instead want to follow the natural progression of acknowledgement and identify what we can control and what we can do right now to make ourselves feel better regardless of our circumstances. If you're hitting a wall in a race where you were going for a specific time goal, just as I was at the New York City Marathon last year, rather than die a slow, painful death to the finish line where you're gonna miss your goal anyway, maybe you slow down, allow some of that pressure you put on yourself to melt away, and open yourself up to enjoying other aspects of the race day experience. That allowed me to have a way more fun time than I would have if I had remained in denial. Speaking of fun, if you've lost that sense of fun in your training, this is the stage where you should absolutely go seek out a group run, sign up for a race, or throw the no fun training plan out the window and revisit those things that made running fun for you in the first place. And if something absolutely terrible happens to you, if you break your leg or you're given terrible news and it feels like there's just nothing you can do in the moment to fix it, you are always entitled to enjoy simple, tried and true pleasures that make you feel better. There is no shame in treating yourself to a milkshake, watching a crappy rom-com by yourself, taking a long hot shower, or whatever else will make you feel more comfortable in the moment. The last coping strategy I want to go over is long-term planning and reflection. This is the trickiest part because it does force us to confront things that we could have done differently if we were responsible for our setback. And even if we weren't, this is where we start thinking ahead about what we can do to get ourselves back on the right track. This is a pretty complicated step, and how you take this step is really going to depend on your situation, but my general advice is to give yourself a day, plan one day ahead, always giving yourself something constructive to look forward to every day, so that when you wake up in the morning, you have a sense of direction. So where the previous tip was more about identifying what you can control in the immediate moment, this is more about gradually charting a path and keeping yourself accountable and motivated by setting short-term, ideally measurable goals that are easily achievable and will provide positive reinforcement. This doesn't have to be in the form of actual training. Your goal tomorrow might be to make an appointment with a physical therapist. It might be to start keeping a record of your sleep schedule. It might be to wait until the day after your race to reflect on how it went down. Or it might be something as simple as tomorrow, I'm gonna allow myself to cry. This is about your process. It's about you allowing yourself to both grieve and move forward at the same time. The great thing is that by following all of the earlier steps, you should have a pretty good idea of what's best for you. And even if you don't, you'll have saved a lot of time and grief in the process of figuring out where you go from here. Okay, I think that just about covers it for now. I realize that's a lot to chew on, and if you're watching this video because you're currently going through a rough patch, I really wish you well, and I truly believe that as long as you remember your strength and you never forget that resilience can be rewarded, you're gonna figure it out and you're gonna take the world by storm when you come back, even if that looks different from what you originally envisioned. At the end of the day, context is everything. An Olympic gold medalist who was born with the most talent in the world can be just as impressive as someone who's had to climb mountains just to cross the finish line. Until next time, happy running.